So here's what we're going to do. Maybe to start, I would just say, have you ever said that you would do something, and then a little bit later on, you've kind of wondered, why did I say I would do that? You know, that's just one of those human experiences. Maybe it was a project at work. It seemed like a good idea. And as soon as it got going, you realized this is a nightmare. What have I said I would do? Maybe it was a family favor, just turned out to be a lot of work. I'm having a little bit of that feeling to start today. And the reason is this. I had heard and gone over a list of faith's toughest questions that Christians asked. Heard this about a year and a half ago. It was a broad poll that was taken, and as I heard them, it all rang true. It's stuff that I've heard from people many, many times. And I just told myself, it's about a year and a half ago, I thought, we need to go through a series like that. We need to take these questions on and look at them. Now, as we approach that day, I'm getting a little nervous. I realize you didn't put me in this position. I just said I would do it, and now I'm doing it. Here's one of my challenges. I think that I'm going to have a difficult time covering all of these concerns and questions in a way that would fully satisfy everybody here. And so I want you to know, I'm not going to cover this perfectly. I'm going to go for adequate in this particular series. But the goal of this is one. The church ought to be a place where we can talk about our doubts. This ought to be a comfortable place to say, I'm really having some big questions about what I've heard or what I've believed in the past. We ought to be able to say it and talk about it here. And that's really what I hope to do. And so what I'm going to do is in this series, How Can I Be Sure About? I'm going to go through these now 7 most asked questions. And the reason is one of them was the question of science in the Bible. And when I first got a hold of this, I did actually the lesson on science in the Bible at the end of 2017. I don't expect any of you remember that. But we're also coming to the end of a 7-week study next week that the young people have gone through on that particular topic. So I'm going to let that be that. If you've got more questions, ask that. And we'll cover these 7. Why is there so much evil in the world? If God is good, if God is in charge, that seems to be the overall number one all the time. But the others we'll look at is what about the question of hell? Is it real? Do we need to talk about it? Why is there so much killing in the Old Testament? Why are there times when it seems like God could show up, but he doesn't show up? And what about Jesus? How exactly does that impact my life? Why are there so many hypocrites in the church is another oft asked question of Christians. And then what about all the rest of my doubts? And I'll try to put that all into a final in this particular series. But again, I will do my best to do this as adequately as I can. I do want to, however, prompt you to more questions and study and even debate. Here's something that I love about God. God is not afraid of your questions. God's not worried about some kind of argument or debate that he cannot get the best of in any of our questions of God. And so in Isaiah 1:18, it starts that idea that the Lord says, come, let us talk about these things. Now, God doesn't run from questions. However, he doesn't answer all of our questions. And you need to know that going into this. There are some things that will be left unknown because faith and certainty do not coexist. It's really hard to smash those up together because as soon as you reach certainty, you have all sight in a question. You no longer walk by faith. That's the challenge of doing that. You see, when you say that, it makes faith seem very hard, and the fact is, faith is very hard. And I want to be real about that. In fact, this doesn't make it much easier. Hebrews 11 verse 1 says about faith, it means being sure of things we hope for and knowing that something is real even when we do not see it. There's just no way around it. That's difficult. But that's my conviction. I believe that real faith is a real struggle. That there's some divine purpose to us wrestling through and questioning and facing these things head on that helps us to grow. And I've just seen this in my life, and maybe this rings true to you. That it seems to be those people whose faith has never really been tested that tend to make faith look like it's an easy journey. You know what I mean? It's all good, it's all great, never been tested, never been tried. But those people in my life that I've seen who have a faith that is unshakable are people whose faith has been tested and tried. They've been up against opposition, and what they've come out of with, not only a seriously tested faith, they've come up with a faith that is certain God has answers even when I don't. I actually, there's a proof to this in my own mind. I call this the teabag proof, and it looks like this. You know, Christians are like tea bags in the sense that you don't know what flavor it's going to be, or you don't know what their character is going to be until they hit hot water. And when your faith is tested and when you're challenged, if you'll take that head on, if you'll wrestle that out, I do think your faith can in fact grow stronger. Because having genuine doubts does not mean that you have a disingenuous faith. Genuine faith does not exclude doubt. For example, before Jesus ascended into heaven, he commissioned his disciples and he gathers them together and says, when they saw him, just think about this, when they saw the resurrected Lord, haven't we all said, if I could have just seen, then I'd have no doubt. No, when they saw him, they worshiped him, but some doubted. Now, are you telling me you can worship God, you can worship Jesus and still have doubts? And it looks like the answer to that is yes, you can. In fact, I would imagine every week I'm talking to people who have some serious questions, who have some lingering doubts. And if that's true, that's fine. You still come and you wrestle that out. See, Jesus, I believe you're on the throne, but why is there so much suffering in this world? What am I supposed to believe about that? Or what about all that killing and vengeance and violence in the Old Testament? Like, how do I reconcile that to a gospel of peace? Or why does Christianity have to be so exclusive? You know, what about all those really good people in the world or those places in the world? I feel like they've never even heard. And what am I supposed to believe about hell? You see, we all have questions, and that's okay. Because God doesn't just want our hearts, He wants our minds. Now, I want you to be very careful about this because the opposite is equally true. God doesn't just want your mind, He wants your heart too. You see, God doesn't expect you to turn off your brain so that you can follow Him. That's not at all a call of the gospel. And besides, when you ignore your doubts, when you ignore your questions, do they just go away? No, that doesn't seem to work either. You see, being a doubter is not the same as being a non-believer. In fact, doubting literally means to be a stand double or a double standing. It means, in my mind, I'm standing here on this issue, but I kind of got one foot over here too. And really what's happening is I'm wrestling out, where am I going to end up? Now, I would say this, that doubt is in fact, can be a wrestling with God. And I think that's a good thing. You get stronger when you wrestle. And in fact, there's this wonderful story. I couldn't do this series without starting here. In the Bible, this dad with a sick son, right? In fact, his son is demon possessed. Do you remember that? I mean, that would cause any parent to not only worry, but be concerned, like to have some doubts. And so he comes to Jesus. He says in Mark 9, verse 22, "Have mercy on us and help us if you can." What a statement. Desperate, questioning, wondering, and Jesus' answer, "What do you mean if I can?" Anything is possible if a person believes. And the father instantly cried out, "I do believe, but help me overcome my unbelief." What an honest and humble prayer that is for us to look at. I believe, but I've still got these big questions. And so that's what I want to do in this series. I want to look at some of faith's toughest questions. And maybe as we start, you're saying, well, I don't really struggle with my faith. Good for you. But somebody does. And you're going to run into them. This is how God works. You're going to run into someone who does struggle with that. And I hope at the very least this series could give you some ammunition, something that could help prep you and prepare you and equip you to help and encourage that person when they're in need. And I would just say this to everyone this morning. Don't be afraid to wrestle. I know that every week I have the opportunity to preach to good people with big questions. And I'm challenging you today. Don't give up on your struggle. Don't give up on God. Because if you give up on God, you're giving up on more than perhaps you realize. You see, some people think, I've got all these questions, I've got all these challenges, and so I'll get rid of God and then those challenges go away. Listen, when you decide to live a life without God, you buy into a worldview that has some conclusions that I think you should doubt. And here's what I mean. When we live a life where there is no God, it means that there is no meaning in our life. I'll play this out for you a little bit. The fact is, it's intellectually dishonest to claim that life has meaning when you live in a meaningless universe where you are just a cosmic accident. It's hard to overstate, actually, just how much this one man, Bertrand Russell, British philosopher, how much impact he has had on academia in our country alone. Here's something he wrote. He said, in this ginormous universe, there is a fragment called the Milky Way. And in that little fragment, there is a tiny speck. We call that the solar system. And on that speck, there's a little dot, and that little dot is the Earth. And on that dot, there are these lumps of carbon and water moving around. And they crawl around just a few years until they dissolve into the elements of which they were compounded. Now, I'm going to say that's an interesting worldview. That's a worldview without God. Now, if that's your worldview, if you buy that view in exchange for a worldview where God exists, how do you find meaning and purpose in your life? And I want to be honest about this. You see, in order to find meaning in your life, you have to believe that your life is making a difference somehow. That it has purpose, that it has real meaning. But if you're subscribing to a worldview where the universe is telling you, you are so little, you are so small, you mean nothing, next to nothing, how do you build a life that says it's making a difference? Because the universe doesn't care that you're irrelevant, you just are. So how do you find peace with that worldview? Well, here's what you have to do. You focus on the present. You focus on right now. And you try to make yourself just as happy as you can be right here and right now. And the problem with that, what makes that frustrating, is life has so many issues beyond your control that make it hard to be really happy right here and right now. But I'll tell you what you don't do with this worldview, is you don't think about the ultimate consequences of that view. Nothingness is hard to contemplate for very long. Meaningless and emptiness. But see, if you're a Christian, what you do is when life throws difficult things your way, and it absolutely will, is you think, you know, it's great that life is more than just life right now. That the little good I'm trying to do here, it's putting treasures in heaven. There's something beyond this world. That my view has eternal consequences and rewards. Now, I think there's an irony in that, and the fact is that a lot of atheists say, well, you Christians never use your brain. You guys just aren't thinking. And the fact is, it's the opposite. We think all the time. I mean, we're constantly thinking about the ultimate consequences of our worldview and what's going to come of our decisions and choices today. But to be an atheist, to be happy, you have to not think about that future. I like the quote from John Ortenberg, who writes, and he's a preacher who's written several books, but he said, I've never heard someone say, once I learned there was no God or life after death, it changed my life. The law of natural selection set me free from my addiction, and random choice has made my life more brave, purposeful, and meaningful. And there's some honesty there. And so maybe you're different. Maybe you think, no, I don't need God to have meaning. I'll make my own meaning. Okay, play that out. I'll find meaning in being a great parent. I'll find meaning in creating beautiful art or making beautiful music, or I'll find meaning in helping the disadvantaged in this world. All right, but remember this. What you say gives you meaning, the universe says ultimately is meaningless, empty. It doesn't amount, it's irrelevant. You see, the universe doesn't care if you're a good dad or a deadbeat dad. But even more, and this is important, what you sacrifice in this view is the possibility of justice. So you say your meaning comes from helping the poor, and someone else says, well, you know, I'm only here a little while, and I'd like to be just as rich as possible, and so I'm going to get that money however I can, and if I have to exploit the poor, that's what I'm going to do. And who's to say your meaning is better than my meaning? Because when we say we're going to get rid of God, we're not just forfeiting meaning, we're actually doing away with morals. So here's the reason for this. Secularism can tell us what life is, but it cannot tell us what life ought to be. Now, I want to be very careful here. I'm not saying that if you don't believe in God, that you're not a moral person. In fact, you might have morals that are above reproach, and we all know exactly what that means. But what I am saying is that if you do not believe in God, you cannot promote moral obligation. You cannot say with any weight that what is right for you is necessarily right for someone else. It just doesn't work. In fact, here's a quote from Richard Taylor. He's an ethicist, that's somebody who studied ethics, and an atheist philosopher who said, to say that something is wrong because it is forbidden by God is perfectly understandable. But to say that something's wrong when there is no God to forbid it is not understandable. I want you to think that through. You see, the concept of moral obligation is unintelligible apart from the idea of God, because the morality of secularism is self-authorizing. We make the decision. We make the call. We create it ourselves. And so here's the trouble. What you decide is right for you, you can't tell me is right for me too. So you're a good person. You decide, it's right for me to be faithful to my wife. That's a great thing. But your neighbor says, what's right for me is to pursue pleasure at any cost, including if it's with your mate. Now, how are you going to tell me my pursuit is wrong? We have no standard there. How is your morality any better than mine? And I want to play this out a little further into the greatest challenge of faith. You see, the most asked question by far is, what do we do with suffering and evil in this world? If God is so good and ultimately in control, why is there so much pain and suffering in this world? And I would say this morning, that's a fair question. And that's a hard question. And some are led to think that if they just get rid of God, then this wouldn't be a problem in our world anymore. And I just think, really? Does getting rid of God make the world more just? Does it make it pursue righteousness anymore? Here's the ultimate question. If I get rid of God, why would I even care if the world is just? What does it ultimately matter? How does justice go together with survival of the fittest as a worldview? And in fact, just put it to the test. Do we put animals on trial? You got this large animal. It maims, kills a smaller animal and its children, and it takes its home. And we all shout out with injustice, that animal needs to go on trial. No, we don't expect that to happen. That animal's just doing what comes naturally. So why shouldn't we expect, or why should we expect more highly evolved lumps of carbon and water to live that exact same way? In fact, the more I look at this, I wonder, why does the world just expect exploitation and selfishness and injustice to be a part of a world where we're all just fighting for real estate and resources, just trying to crawl around a little longer than the next? Why isn't that our expectation? You see, what's happened over time, and I see this more and more in our world, is that we're living in a world that does not believe in the intrinsic value of mankind. What we believe in is the ascribed value of the human being. Other people are only important if they can still do something that we think is useful. So the New Yorker magazine and the New England Journal of Medicine say that the preeminent philosopher of our day is a man named Peter Singer. And he teaches at Princeton, and he's an atheist, and he just wants to be honest about his view. And so here's some things that he has said. He says, I just want to be honest about this, and so we should stop saying that children are alive for the first 28 days. Now, he believes this with this theory in mind because it gives parents time to decide whether or not letting that child continue to live would lead to their ultimate happiness. For example, if that child were born with extreme medical problems, that child would be a burden. I mean, how could those parents be happy? And if that child died and another healthier child took its place, well, that would create more happiness. You see, therefore, what he's saying is not just that it would not be wrong to let the child die who had massive health problems. He's saying if it wouldn't bother others, it wouldn't be wrong for the parents to kill that child. Now, I know that's an extreme example, and some of you are saying we will never live in a society where we allow parents to kill babies. We're there. In fact, we're beyond that. Think about this. Already, our legislature gets together and they're trying to make laws and are debating over whether or not we could say it's humane to kill elderly people or those with extreme sickness or the mentally handicapped because they become a burden on others around. Did you see what's happened there? There's no intrinsic value in these people. And it only happens when we stop looking at the God-placed value on the individual human being. And we start looking at everything in terms of what will give me the most happiness in the moment. And so here's a challenge for you. If you're a history buff, look through history. And let me ask you, has any society in human history had a loss of religious faith and created an increase in this idea that the individual has value in them alone. The fact is, it hasn't. See, why do we? Why do we believe that humans all have this great value in them? Why do we believe it's wrong to hurt people? Where does that idea come from? Do you know that this was never the concept of the ancient world? They didn't come up with this. No one in the ancient world believed that a woman was as valuable as a man, or that a servant had as much worth as a human being as his master had. You see, in the ancient world, if your wife was pregnant and you wanted a boy but she had a girl, you know what you'd do? You'd just take that little girl and you'd throw her on the trash heap because she wasn't worth anything to you. And that was okay. In the ancient world, that was just seen as right. What changed? Where did the idea that life has meaning and equal value come from? Well, the Bible teaches that. It's a Judeo-Christian ethic. In fact, it was Christians who started saying, you know, a woman is as valuable as a man is in God's eyes. They are equal in that sense, that slaves have as much worth as their masters, and that if you throw that baby girl on the trash, we'll go pick her up and raise her in our house because she means something. In fact, it was Christians who, when plagues hit cities and people moved out of the cities so that they could survive and the sick could just die, Christians moved in and cared for the sick. Because Christians bought in to a different idea of the world. They have a unique worldview. You see, Christians believe the rich should help the poor, and the healthy should care for the sick, and that the able should love the disabled. But it only makes sense when we believe that God has placed value in every single person, and that our lives have value because God gave them value, and in the end, we're all accountable to that maker. You know, way before Jesus taught it, the Bible said this in Proverbs 14:31. Those who oppress the poor insult their maker, but helping the poor honors him. So here's what's happening in our world. And maybe you feel some of this tension. Modern secularism is really confused right now. It's like chasing its tail. Because on one corner, they're shouting out, we need social justice. We need individual rights. We need individual care. We need to value those who've been overlooked. They're shouting this out while at the same time they're diminishing and destroying the very ethics system that started that in the first place. God's value on people. And you can't have both. So here's what we need. We need God not to explain to us what is. We need him to explain to us what ought to be. Now listen. I'm not trying to minimize anybody's struggle this morning. If you're wrestling over whether or not to believe in God, I'm so glad you're here, and I hope you'll keep coming and you'll wrestle with that. You'll keep that up. But if you buy into a worldview where there is no God, you're buying into a worldview with some startling consequences. And that's what happened to Andrea Dilley. She was raised by medical missionaries. They were Christians who helped people living in the slums of Nairobi in Kenya. As a young girl, she saw so much suffering, so much pain. It really caused her to question God. And by her 20s, she just completely left her faith in God and the church she was a part of all her life. Now, one day, she was having a conversation with a friend who was arguing that there is no God. And in that particular argument, he started to come up with the idea that morality is all subjective, that there's no absolute right or wrong that fits for everyone. And she found herself pushing back on that concept. And she said, just wait a minute. You're trying to tell me that we can't absolutely say that Hitler was wrong in what he was doing? Are you trying to tell me that it's okay that we starve and abuse children? And as she started arguing, she said, there's just got to be this higher standard where we can measure ourselves by moral. And she stopped and she kind of looked at her hand. She said, I think I'm arguing about God. And so she writes, when people ask me what drove me out of the doors of the church, and then what brought me back, my answer to both questions is the same. I left the church in part because I was mad at God about human suffering and injustice. And I came back to the church because that same struggle. I realized that I could never talk about justice without standing inside a theistic framework. In a naturalistic worldview, a parentless orphan in the slums of Nairobi could only be explained in terms of survival of the fittest. We're all just animals, slumming it in a godless world, fighting for space and resources. The idea of justice doesn't really mean anything. And then she closes with this. To talk about justice, you have to talk about objective morality. And to talk about objective morality, you have to talk about God. So what do? I'm struggling to believe. And I'm arguing that that's not the best way to end your wrestling match, to just say there is no God. What I want to do is I want to ask you to try, instead of saying there's no God, to come to know God. And here's the point. Maybe the God you're mad at, maybe the God you're disappointed in, is a misformed or deformed image of the real God. And just factually, God's been the victim of a lot of terrible interpretations in our time. And what I don't want to do in this series is to say, well, now here's a real hard question, and here's a real simplistic answer. Now stop struggling with that. That's not it at all. My goal is to increase your confidence, to develop the instinct that even when I don't have all the answers, I believe God is someone I can trust. And so to do that, we're going to need two things. And the first is this: to know God is going to take honesty. Remember, God wants us to love Him with our minds as well. So if someone gives you a hard question, please don't pretend you didn't hear them. Don't treat them like they're some sort of spiritual leper. You see, Jesus never flinched when He got hard questions from truth seekers. This church needs to be a place where people can ask hard questions and where we can admit sometimes we have doubts. You guys remember Thomas, right? He wasn't there when Jesus first appeared to all the disciples, and when they told him what they'd seen, he said, I don't believe it. In fact, I won't believe it unless I see it for myself. Now, what I love is that Scripture does not tell the rest of the disciples, saying to Thomas, that you can't be a part of us. Get out of this room altogether. We don't want anything to do with you. No. A week later, Jesus shows up, and Thomas would have never come to know the risen Christ if the disciples had shunned him or shamed him or run him out for questioning. So pay close attention to this awe-inspiring quote from a brother of Jesus. Be merciful to those who doubt. If someone is wrestling with their faith, they don't need you to fight against them. They need you to get alongside and fight with them. A man named Mike McHargue wrote a book, Finding God in the Waves, and he talks about how science led him away from faith in God and how eventually science brought him back to God. But during that time, he was really struggling to believe in God. He wouldn't talk to anybody about it. He wouldn't tell anyone, especially his mother and his wife. He was just really afraid of what that might do to them. And when he finally got honest and finally got real, he was actually shocked at their reactions. They didn't join him in his unbelief, but they didn't demean him. They didn't run him down, and they didn't run him off. He said something very important in his book. He said, if you're a Christian who wonders what to do with someone who's in doubt, consider these words carefully. Love and grace speak loudly. The first and best response to someone whose faith is unraveling is a hug. My path back to God was paved by grace by those who received my doubt in love. So, if you're not sure you believe, I'm glad you're here. You're always welcome here. But I need to ask you a question now. You see, I want you to be honest about doubt. But I also want you to be honest about why you doubt. You see, the reality is sometimes doubt is just a dodge. Sometimes we conclude that there is no God because we don't want to change the way we're living. And that's just a reality. You see, admitting that there's a God means submitting to that God. Now, I'm just asking, and I think it's fair for me to do this, is it possible that behind some of your doubt is a heart that doesn't want to fully surrender to God? Now, you can wrestle with God. I'm just here to tell you this morning, please do, because God is loving, He is gracious, He is gentle, He will not crush you. You can wrestle with God, and you'll know you're wrestling with God. But ultimately, you're going to have to concede. And so we need to bring to our pursuit of knowing God not only honesty, but humility. You see, knowing God means humbly admitting that you can never fully know God. God is always going to be bigger than our intellect. You see, God tells us this all throughout His Word. You have to pay just slight attention to get this. In Isaiah 55 and verse 9, for just as the heavens are higher than the earth, so are my ways higher than your ways, and my thoughts than your thoughts. And again, Romans 11 at verse 33, oh, how great are God's riches and wisdom and knowledge, how impossible it is for us to understand His decisions and His ways. Now please, I'm not trying to bully you into turning your mind off. I'm trying to say that faith takes mind and heart. And I'm not trying to say that faith is anti-intellectual. What I am saying is that it requires acknowledging that God is far greater than our finite intellect. Complete understanding of this great being is not going to be achieved in our finite mind. You don't have to completely understand God to have faith in Him. Think about this. A God that is so small that my little brain, or even some of your more evolved brains, could fully explain Him, is not a God worth worshiping. And so I'm going to ask you, are you humble enough to bow down to a God that you will never fully figure out? Because the struggle for faith is often a struggle for pride. Behind a lot of our questions often lurks an unspoken assumption. If I were God. You see, if I were God, I could do better. Now, it's not that we don't believe there's a God. We just aren't sure we like the God we know. And if I was God, I'd do a better job than He's doing right now. If I were God, I would never put that tree in the garden to tempt them in the first place. If I were God, first of all, if I were God, there'd never be snakes. I'd have killed that thing as soon as it showed up. That'd be gone. And if I were God, there wouldn't be this suffering in the world. There wouldn't be anything like the concept of hell around. You see, deep down, we sometimes think we could do a better job than God. And our questions, if you really boil them down, often are about the character of God. Look, I don't have all the answers for you this morning, but I do want to leave you with one last question. In all of this, have you considered Jesus? See, we're asking, how can I be sure? Well, how can I be sure about Jesus? Why doesn't God just eliminate all the confusion and once for all just be clear about Himself? Well, the Bible actually says He did. In Hebrews 1:3, it says the Son radiates God's own glory and expresses the very character of God. Now, I know you've all heard and understand that Jesus is like God. But do you understand that God is like Jesus? So what does Jesus show us about the character of God? Well, He's the kind of God that comes after Thomas. Thomas doubted, He came after him. He's the kind of God that heals the son of a man who is wrestling to believe what he just can't wrap his mind around. And He's the kind of God that comes after people with so many questions that they stop coming after Him. I don't have all the answers, but here's what I know. I believe in the God that revealed Himself in Jesus of Nazareth. But if I were God, listen, if you and I were God, there would be no cross. Because the biggest question of all time was, what about our sin? What about our rebellion? How is that ever going to be made right? And God in the person of Jesus became like you and me, and He put Himself on a cross that He didn't deserve to be on, and He died for sins that He didn't commit. And that's the God that I've learned to trust. It doesn't answer every question, but I'll tell you, it answers one really important one. Does God love me? You see, at its core, faith is not belief in a statement, and it's not even the answer to all our questions. At its core, faith is trust in a person. And if Jesus is God, I believe in Him. I'll just leave you with one last story here. In the 1970s, there was a prayer meeting every week in the White House. Christians from every form of government would get together. They would pray for our country. They'd pray about what was going on. And being a Christian gathering, they were all a little bit surprised when Arthur Burns showed up. Arthur Burns is a well-respected man, but he's Jewish. He doesn't believe in Christ as the Messiah. But they all loved that he was there, and he was there every week. They never asked him to lead a prayer. Until one day, a newcomer, didn't know Arthur Burns' chosen faith, asked him to lead the prayer. Before anybody could say or do anything, he grabbed the hands of the men next to him. He bowed his head and he prayed this. Lord, I ask that Jews everywhere will come to know Jesus Christ. And I pray that Muslims everywhere will come to know Jesus Christ. And finally, Lord, I pray that Christians everywhere will come to know Jesus Christ. You see, in the end, Jesus is the answer. He represents God fully. He gives us what we need to know. And I don't want in any way to diminish questions or thoughts you have. In fact, we're going to spend some time wrestling these out in the next few weeks. But as we do, I just ask you to be honest and humble and approach God, who by His love and grace has already approached us. And if you're not a Christian this morning, you have a chance to come to Jesus, to meet Him where He's at. He died for you to set you free. You can be buried with Him in baptism, set free from your sin. And you can live a life free from sin, not free from all doubt, not free from every question, but where you can choose to trust and put your faith in a God who loves you and gave Himself for you. If you're ready to become a child of God this morning, you can do that. If you need our prayers while we're here, please ask. If we can help you in any way, let us know. And let's stand and sing our final song of encouragement.